You're listening to the Bear in Mind podcast, episode number 28.
A podcast uncovering identity, color, and love, where driving yourself crazy is totally sane and curable. Now your host, T. Bias.
I mean, who really understands anger? I know I didn't. For a really long time, I, on the surface, looked like a really calm person. And then I think the anger would build, and then to somebody I loved, I would probably yell and then, blame them. And with friends and stuff, I would hold on to that anger and it'd become like resentment. And a while ago, I did some reading on anger and emotions in general. And so I kind of feel like I have a basis level understanding of anger. So today I'm actually just going to share with you my understanding of it through reading and through trying to actually change how I handle anger in my life. And I still continue to learn a lot about anger, so it's actually kind of fun to reread a book, one of my first books that I read about anger, which is The Dance of Anger by Harriet Lerner, and then kind of revisit some of my thoughts and have some of those reflections. So today I'm actually going to share with you some falsehoods that I think that I've been taught and that society teaches us about anger, and then go through a couple of things where I've looked at anger differently and I'm kind of more aware of anger in these kind of constructs. So before I go into the falsehoods, I actually want to talk about what anger is. And the way I view anger is that you're basically not getting something that you want. One of your needs or your desires are not getting met. And also, one of your belief systems or values are being challenged. And that, for me, has kind of simplified what anger is. And that brings me to the first falsehood. We often tend to confuse anger and rage. And rage is very much more of the physical violence that you see and verbal violence that you see. And anger is more in the realm of you're irritated, you're frustrated, you do yell, you blame, and things like that. So we tend to confuse those two. And so today I'm only going to actually be talking about anger and not rage. And so that brings me to the second falsehood, is that because we tend to confuse anger and rage, we also tend to view anger as bad. And we may even view anger by itself without any sort of the physical expression of it as bad. We may think any expression of it, a slightly raised voice. We have this tendency to think that it's a bad emotion, a negative emotion. And no emotion is actually either positive or negative. It's actually our own opinion about what an emotion is, whether that emotion is good or bad. And society tends to clump emotions like that, like happy is really good and angry is really bad. And the way to kind of maybe tackle that belief system that anger is bad is that every human being has this emotion. And in fact, in almost all cultures, I think every culture has this expression. And this is from studies by Paul Ekman, where he went into different societies that weren't exposed to television and things like that, where he defined anger as a universal human emotion. The third falsehood is that we think anger is justified in certain situations. So we may think our anger is legit because somebody is yelling at us. We may think that our anger is justified because of something somebody did and it was their responsibility. So anger isn't legit in certain situations and then not legit in other situations. And everyone has a human right to feel anger. However, there is no right or wrong as to when you should or should not feel anger. And that brings me to the last falsehood, which for me, this was a big one. We are often taught that venting anger helps reduce anger. It helps the anger out. when in fact, it actually does the opposite. It makes us more angry. And the reason is that when you're often telling somebody a story, you are reliving that anger by telling that story. You're having the same thoughts and the emotions come up from telling that story. And why we may think that venting is useful is that it often is because the other person may be sympathetic and identify with our anger. However, if a person doesn't identify with their anger, it's not that we feel better from that. So it's actually our thoughts about how that person responds to our anger is what makes venting feel good. But in an overall context, venting actually brings up anger. So after unlearning these falsehoods, I was able to better understand anger. And so I have 3 frameworks that I use to help me when I am feeling angry. So the first framework is actually viewing anger as 100% about the self. It's going to be the emotion that tells you about what your wants and needs are. And so then it's up to us to gain better clarity into what our actual desires and needs are in life. And the tool that I use is actually rephrasing I need or I want statements that you make. So an example is, let's say I have a roommate and I want my roommate to be out of the apartment. And I'll often say, I need him to be out of the apartment. And that actually doesn't give me clarity into what I actually need. It's giving me clarity into what I would like my roommate to do, but it doesn't give me any clarity into what I actually want. And I rephrase that phrase, I need, without putting the other person in that phrase. So I need my roommate to not be in the apartment. Instead, it's I need my space. And another example of this is I need you to stop talking. Instead, it would become, I would take out the you part, you stop talking, and I would say, I need quiet. And rephrasing some of those things that we say when we say I want or I need, and it involves another person in that sentence, it's trying to find what your need is without involving that other person. And so when you look at I need my space, all of a sudden I can see more options open up to me rather than just my roommate leaving the apartment. It now needs to be about me getting my own sense of space. And there's a number of ways that I can do that. I could go somewhere else to be by myself, and it doesn't rely on the actions of another person. Or if my anger is stronger, it could very well be telling me that I do need my space and I want my space, and that maybe I need to live by myself. So anytime you kind of find yourself saying, I need this person to do this, or I need this, or I want them to do this, know that if you can rephrase it back to something that you actually need without involving that other person, you will be able to gain clarity about what you actually need, and then also maybe see a whole lot of options open up to you about getting those needs met. Now, the reason why it's difficult to actually rephrase the I need, I want statements to gain clarity about what you need to do is because of the second framework, is that anger is actually very reactive. And there's advantages and disadvantages to the fact that anger is very reactive. And the disadvantage is that anger, when we feel anger, we feel like we need to take action right now. And if we're not in danger or anything like that, we don't actually ever need to take action in that moment when we're feeling angry. We actually need to just take some distance and this is where the advantage of anger being reactive is useful, is that because anger is so reactive, it's very fast. And I actually didn't know this about anger. So if you can get kind of that space or that distance from feeling anger, or you're in that moment of feeling like you need to do something with your anger, and if you take a moment to step away, let's say you're in an argument with someone and you step away and you walk away and you take some space to calm down, anger moves through your body very quickly. It can move through your body, and this is if you let it move through your body and you don't resist it, it actually can pass through you in about 30 seconds, anywhere from 30 seconds to about 2 minutes. So that's kind of the advantage of its reactivity. It can actually pass through you quite quickly, and you can come to a state of calmness really quickly. And the third framework I actually learned from the book Dance of Anger by Harriet Lerner is that when you're feeling guilty, you can't feel anger. And guilt is when you feel like you've wronged another person, and anger is when you feel like you've been wronged. And this one really helped me because in the beginning I said I was naturally kind of this calm person, and then I would kind of blow up at somebody and I would yell and blame them. And that calmness actually came from the fact that I would feel guilty a lot of times in friendships or relationships where I felt like I wasn't doing enough, like I was wronging the other person. But like any other emotion, if you keep feeling it over and over again, it reaches its limit, and then it kind of explodes, and then it becomes this intense anger. And so one of the things I took away is that when we're feeling guilty and we think that we have wronged another person, it might be a signal early on that there's some underlying anger that might come up, meaning maybe actually you're not meeting your needs and your wants, and you're still trying to obtain it from the other person by trying to do more and more and more. And then eventually it reaches its limit, and then it eventually switches over to this really kind of intense anger. So that was actually a lot of information about anger. And I would have to say, if I had to sum it up, the way I viewed anger is something that Harriet Lerner said in her book, In the Dance of Anger, is that we often march off to battle not even understanding what the war is all about. And that's probably where I was at with anger. I would just constantly react to stuff and not really understand what was happening within me and understanding myself. So I'm going to wrap it up with a quote from her book. And she writes, "Those of us who are locked into ineffective expressions of anger suffer as deeply as those of us who dare not to get angry at all." I'll check back with you next week.
Thanks for listening. Listen for a new episode next Tuesday by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform. Bye for now.